time last, I also wanted to attend the panel for, I think, framing some of our big challenges in this area. And one further question I had, picking up on what was said about competitiveness and a more comprehensive government role. I'm thinking particularly of the region of Israel and China, and I'm heading to Kenya over the weekend. And I'm wondering what you see in terms of the U.S. government role, whether and how there are ways we might react more or be more present in an area where they are very present. That's just one region, but I think the question probably goes more broadly to what is the government role. They have a toolkit which is somewhat different than ours. Thank you.
Al, you've dealt with China, and any thoughts?
And China and Africa and so forth.
Yeah.
Let me just make a few quick observations. One, I do think that even though the strategic and economic dialogue has a little bit of a feel of the heaviness of Gorchir Amir and so forth, that that it's nevertheless important to really engage with the Chinese across the board in the way that the last two, this administration, the previous one, have done. Second, I think one of the very important issues on which it's important to deal with China is on this issue of piracy and counterfeit goods, which is a big part of our export potential that we can do better on if we can address that problem. Third, I've harped a lot about the anti-corruption issue, but it's important that China, to the surprise of many, a Chinese delegation was here in August, and we hosted them as Transparency International. And before I could tell the Director General, who was leading the delegation, you guys ought to enact your own FCPA, he told me that they were going to do it. I had people laugh at me in the face when I passed that information along, and yet 2 weeks ago they did pass their own law. Will it be implemented fully in the first year? Well, if it is implemented fully, they'll be light years ahead of the Europeans when they first enacted their law. So that's important. And the last point, I guess, is just I think we need to work with China to help them adopt the sort of sensible policies towards promoting development that we've tried to pursue through the OECD Development Assistance Committee, how you do foreign assistance in the right way. I think that we need to try to discipline efforts to lock up minerals. In my private life as a fake lawyer, as a diplomat working at a law firm, one of my big successes of the last year was to help save a substantial investment in Africa of an American oil firm that was, being subjected to big problems initially by the government, and then the specter of Chinese trying to edge them out. That got solidified, but it's something that will require strong diplomacy, in my opinion, as well as strong advocacy from groups like my own firm.
Just a small add-on from the FCS perspective. I've been encouraged again in these few months back to the President's Export Council and others wanting to know. I mentioned market imperfections of information and contacts and advocacy and finance, but one of the other challenges American companies often face in their world is competitor nation practices. So there's a defensiveness to that, if nothing else, in our view, and it's been encouraging to have more interest than I've seen in some years now for what do our competitor nations have in terms of support for their companies or their interests, better said. And we have 30 people in Shanghai, and the Germans have 300 or whatever it is. It's a different model, so I mean this is tricky because it's apples and oranges, but again, a more parochial perspective, but I do appreciate this round, this process that's looking at agencies and what's needed to try to actually understand that one of the imperfections to be addressed perhaps is the fact that competitor nations are providing all sorts of things to their interests. How do we want to think about that in terms of our interests and figure out our own answers to them?
But I would just say, Jack, as I think Al and Chuck said, I mean, it's important that we recognize that China is now a competitor. We're not just competing with the Japanese and the Europeans in many, many areas, including in investment and access to natural resources in Africa and Latin America. But I think our model has got to be to figure out what works for us, not to try to ape the Chinese system. It just, we're such different countries, but we start by recognizing that they are an important new competitor in all kinds of ways that they weren't 15 or 10 years ago, and so on. And since I see Susan's going to close this, I just want to put in a plug for our two speakers here today. Each have done articles on these broad topics in the Foreign Service Journal. Al's article on U.S. economic diplomacy the next 50 years, there are copies of both of these out. This was in the February Journal, and Chuck's article is a little older, we won't say old, but has been on the shelf a little longer, but it's still very valuable, and I think, as I read it, I think it's still very pertinent. So I'd encourage people to pick up copies. If they're all gone, then I'm sure Ian and folks here can help you track them down. What? Okay, yeah.
Well, the audience beat me to it. I was going to invite you to applaud, but I want to thank all our panelists and thank you, Sean, for the sort of extra heavy lifting as the moderator, but thank all three of you for really providing, I think, a very, timely and insightful and provoking, analysis where things we all have to focus on. I could see there were a lot more questions. I had some myself, several of you touched on, but we'll hold back in this family, hold back kind of thing. So thank you again, and thank all of you for coming. We appreciate your support for these programs and for the Fund for American Diplomacy, which makes it possible for us to do these things. So thanks again.
Great. Good. No, thanks. That was